r/NoSleep. Posted by you/Lady of Hell. The Midnight Train, Part 14, Fire and Acid. My name is Evelyn and I am a passenger of the Midnight Train. Last time a lot of disgusting things happened and we found out that Amy was, well, moldy. Today, we will meet some new and old faces. But let's continue with the mold situation. Amy stared at her reflection in horror, uttering the word no over and over again. She eventually lifted her hand to her forehead to touch the largest patch of mold, which was located right under her hairline. Tears rolled from her eyes down her cheeks, and in her reflection, they were black and left a dark streak behind. It took a few moments until I had composed myself enough to actually think of calming her. The sight was unsettling, to say the least. Seeing her sick and half-dead was one thing, but the actual extent of her sickness was a lot to take in. Eventually, I grabbed Amy by the shoulder and turned her around. "Don't look at it. Look at me," I ordered her. "It's going to be okay, Amy." "How?" she sobbed. "I'm moldy, Evelyn. I'm dying." "Bullshit. Something's wrong with the train, yeah? We know that. It makes everyone sick, the food becomes a pile of worms, and when we set everything right, you'll be healthy again. Everyone will. We solve this little problem, your mold disappears and we go home." I was just pulling something out of my ass here, to say it bluntly. Who knew if Amy's sickness was even related to the train's problem? I just knew that another breakdown would waste time we could otherwise use to solve said problem and get home already. And if it doesn't go away? How would I know? I was a mechanic, not a doctor. The blind beggar woman is still an option, isn't she? I suggested. Let's talk about that when the time comes. Come on now, let's get some food and look for Sherlock Holmes. Or am I still suspicious? No. No, I trust you, Evelyn. Eve, I corrected. All my friends call me Eve. And she opened her mouth as if to say something, but shut it again without a single word. We exited the bathroom again and finally made our way to the vending machines. I bought a load of chocolate bars and crackers, as well as a few bottles of water, and sat down with Amy next to one of the windows. "I'm not really hungry," Amy said, eyeing the single cracker she held between her fingers. "I literally don't care. Eat," I demanded. She took a while, but it didn't bother me. We sat in comfortable silence and I looked through the wagon, noticing the sickly passengers, the rusty interior, the wires. At the far end of the wagon, right in a dim corner of the ceiling, was something that looked like a bunch of wires, nestled in there like a pit of snakes. I blinked a few times and as I looked back again, it was gone as if it had never been there at all. I thought of my encounter with the still unknown shadow thing again. Hopefully, another conversation with the detective would clear a few more things up. Some time passed, hard to say how much, and I shifted my attention towards Amy again, who had begun to nibble on some chocolate bar. I watched her struggle to keep the food down while emptying a pack of crackers myself as suddenly, we were approached by someone. And it was not the detective. He looked older than I had imagined, around 50 if I had to guess. Tall, thin, bald, dressed in a fancy suit and a black coat. He had pale blue eyes and carried his briefcase in his right hand. His mere presence made me freeze. I admit I hadn't been particularly respectful to the Inhumans I had met up until this point because I hadn't seen any reason for that, but with the man with the briefcase I wouldn't take any chances. He looked sickly, just like all the others, but there was still an aura of power surrounding him, an almost suffocating tension in the air. I was afraid of him. Truly afraid. "Hello, Nicole." His attention was solely focused on Amy for now, the faintest hint of a smile played around his thin lips. And Amy, who was apparently insane, looked nothing but happy to see him. "Hello, sir. Nice to see you," she smiled. "I see you finally left your compartment. I had a wake-up call." She gestured towards me. Now, his pale eyes turned to me. "A new face, right? It is a pleasure to meet you." "Pleasure's all mine, sir." I forced myself to smile as I spoke. "I'm Evelyn, I arrived 2 days ago." "I see," he replied and nodded slowly. "I sure hope you enjoy your journey, Evelyn." "Thanks, sir." I was literally trembling at this point, all I wanted was for him to go away. Amy had other plans, of course. "Do you want some chocolate, sir?" she asked, offering one of the bars. "We have more than enough." He took it with a small smile. "Thank you very much, Nicole. Why don't you sit with us for a while? Tears started to fill her eyes. "It's so good to see a familiar face." The man with the briefcase thanked her for the offer and sat down on the free place next to her, where he actually began to eat his chocolate bar. If I weren't completely terrified, I would have probably laughed at the absurdity of the situation. I couldn't understand why Amy was doing that. This wasn't a friendly conversation with the detective, this was a fucking dance on a volcano. One wrong step and you're dead. "Sir, may I ask you something?" I requested anyways. As he nodded, I continued, "The detective told me there's something wrong with the midnight train. Amy and I want to help, but we need to know more. Could you tell us what the problem is, please?" I was a little proud of myself because I had managed to stay perfectly polite with him. "The train is very sick, Evelyn. Something came aboard and it begins to affect the inhabitants. I think you humans would call it an infection." "How are you, sir?" Amy asked quickly. "I'm quite alright, thank you, Nicole," he reassured her. These two were honestly weird together. It was also weird that he consistently called her Nicole. I knew that was her real name, but after reading the name Amy most of the time and after she introduced herself as such, I just couldn't think of her as Nicole. Not that that was a major concern though. I was just about to ask the next question, which would of course be if he knew what caused the train's disease, when I noticed how hot the wagon had become. The dry heat of a midsummer's day, as if I was standing right under the burning sun. I suddenly had trouble breathing. I tugged at the collar of my shirt which seemed to tight around my throat. And then it hit me. "The Phoenix," I whispered. A nod from the man with the briefcase confirmed my suspicion. I dropped to my knees and grabbed Amy's arm, pulling her down with me. "Don't move," I told her firmly as the air around us grew hotter. The person, no, not person, the monster that appeared in the wagon looked like the devil incarnate. He had dark skin and wore a red suit and his eyes were like lava. No iris, no pupil, just the shifting of bright red fire. He moved with an elegance I hadn't seen before as he walked towards us and the air was almost too hot to breathe at this point. I stayed perfectly still, breathed shallow and kept one hand around Amy's arm. The Phoenix strode down the hall, burning eyes gazing over the few people that were in the wagon. I prayed silently that he would disappear soon, right through the door at the end of the wagon, a few meters after us. As he came closer, I was sure I would burn. And when he stopped right in front of us, I only wished that there would be an afterlife and that I would see my sister there. He didn't look at me though. Not at Amy either. His burning gaze was focused on the man with the briefcase. The man with the briefcase, who had stayed in his seat up until this point, stood up and walked a few steps to stand in front of the Phoenix. "Good evening," he greeted, politely as ever. "Is there anything you need?" The Phoenix looked at him expectantly. "I think we've been over this," the man with the briefcase continued, his voice cold as ice. The tension in the air was so intense, I could barely breathe. It felt like the second before a thunderstorm started, when the air stood still and the sun vanished behind black clouds and all the birds suddenly ceased to sing. A tangible sense of dread. The Phoenix merely smirked. "Don't," the man with the briefcase warned. The first raindrops of the thunderstorm, thick and heavy, a small taste of what to come. Amy tensed. I held my breath. The silence was deafening. And without warning, the first flash of lightning struck. The Phoenix reached his arm out and the air itself seemed to burn. A lightless flame scorched my skin and burnt the oxygen from my lungs. I squeezed my eyes shut in fear the heat would blind me otherwise. Amy gasped. I felt her move ever so slightly and immediately dug my fingers deep into her arm to keep her from doing something stupid. And I thought I would burn. And as a pile of ash, just like Mia. So I kept my eyes shut and prayed for it to be quick and painless and that my sister would be waiting for me on the other side. Death never came, of course. Not for me and not for Amy either. The heat faded, the metaphorical thunderstorm had reached its end and the sun peeked through the dark clouds as the birds started to sing again. I let go off Amy and simply collapsed, resting my forehead against the carpet and let a few tears of relief fall onto the floor. It took a few moments until I noticed Amy tugging on my jacket. "Eve," she called my name, supposedly not for the first time. "Eve." "Oh, give me a break," I muttered under my breath. I had just wanted a few minutes to enjoy the fact I wasn't dead. Was that really too much to ask? When I looked up again, I saw that the Phoenix was gone and the man with the briefcase was lying on the floor, half his body scorched. He was apparently unconscious, large patches of skin were just burned away, leaving nasty, wetting wounds. And inside the open wounds, something squirmed. Like thin, transparent worms, gnawing their way through muscle and bone alike. I had to look away to stop myself from throwing up. "Holy fuck," I whispered. What lay there, looking mere seconds away from death, wasn't just some random monster, it was the man with the briefcase. That was bad. Very, very bad. I didn't think anyone could hurt him, Amy stated, taking the words right out of my mouth. This thing, it burned him, and I sat there and watched and could do nothing. And Amy, I interrupted her harshly, put my hands on her shoulders and turned her around so we stood face to face. Calm down. We have to do something. She broke free from my grasp. We can't let him die, Eve, she insisted, and dropped to her knees next to him. His briefcase. He has something in there that heals wounds. I didn't move. Opening something that belonged to a supernatural entity, especially something as powerful as the man with the briefcase, seemed like a stupid idea to me. And some part of me, some dark, spiteful part, even wanted him to die, because I wanted this goddamn train to suffer for taking my sister away from me. When Amy noticed I wasn't going to help, she grabbed the briefcase herself and tried to pry it open with her bare hands. It has no lock, she complained. Doesn't budge. I looked down at her. She sat on the floor, tears streaming down her face and the briefcase tightly clasped in her bony fingers. Her entire body was shaking and she looked utterly desperate. I knew she wasn't going to leave him, and I also thought that no matter how much I wanted everything in this train dead, we might need him to solve the train's problem. I didn't have much of a choice here. Stay with him, I ordered Amy. Keep him safe or whatever, I'll go find the detective. He'll know what to do. Reluctantly, she nodded and let go off the briefcase, but stayed on the floor right next to him. I reassured her I'd be back soon and then wasted no more time but ran off to the next wagon. The detective had said he would know when I was looking for him. I sure hoped he was in the mood to talk now. I hadn't gone in the direction of the compartments this time, but rather towards the front of the train. The direction didn't matter much, I assumed. These entities would just appear wherever they pleased. I hurried through an entire wagon, threw another door open and stumbled into the next, only to find myself surrounded by darkness. The lights were on, glowing steadily but way too dim. The air was cold enough to make me shiver as I took a few seconds to let my eyes adjust to the darkness, and finally, I could see what was going on around me. Wires, thousands and thousands of wires covered the inside of the wagon, and they were moving ever so slightly, as if they were alive. The electric humming that could be heard throughout the entire train was louder in here. I spun around, ready to leave through the same door I had just entered, but the handle was overgrown with wires now and sparks flew through the air. I was stuck. You're fucking kidding, I muttered. My only hope was that the door on the other end was free. I reached for one of my knives, the larger one, and held it tightly as I made my way through the dark wagon, careful not to touch any of the wires. I supposed I could cut the door free with the knife, but the chance of getting electrocuted was a little too high to actually try. The buzzing sound grew louder until I almost felt its vibrations in my bones. It was the most unpleasant feeling. Eventually, I gave in and covered my ears, but it didn't help at all. For a while, I simply stumbled forward, careful not to trip over any wires. They had overtaken the entire wagon like a cancerous growth, covering the windows and blackening out any light that might have reached inside. My mind tried to piece all the information together, mostly to distract myself from the fear I felt inside this squirming mess. I doubted that this was another symptom of the midnight train's sickness. It was the cause. Movement caught my attention and I saw a figure emerge from the shadows. She was already closer than she had any right to be. I should have noticed her earlier, and yet, here I was, standing face to face with the bandaged girl. She was naked, except for the bandages that covered parts of her body. Dirty, blood-soaked gauze wrapped around her upper left arm, her belly, her right knee, her right wrist and her left eye. Her long blonde hair was soaking wet and so was her skin. She stared at me from dark eyes, her lips were black and slightly parted. I screamed and jerked the hand with the knife up, more out of reflex than with actual intention. The bandaged girl didn't care though. She continued to approach me slowly, her bare feet dragging over the carpet. I stumbled backwards, the humming grew louder and louder and I could barely think straight anymore. When I stepped onto one of the thicker wires, another panicked scream left my throat and I realized that I was walking right into a nest of life, sparking wires. I was backed into a corner. I couldn't make another step without electrocuting myself. The girl got closer and I could do nothing but watch in terror as she stopped and reached her hand towards me. She opened her mouth and revealed a gaping black hole where teeth and a tongue should have been. A voice, coarse like sandpaper, produced two words that I could barely understand, and yet, they were incredibly clear to me. Help me. Her fingers touched my face. It was indeed not water she was soaked in. My next cry was in agony as the acid ate through my skin. I pressed one hand to the wounds that formed in my cheek, deep and wet but not bleeding. The knife was still in my other hand. I could have easily reached her with the blade, but the thought of another contact with the acid made me hesitate. I just knew she wouldn't bleed like a normal person. I didn't see her disappear as I fell to my knees, a hand still pressed to my face. The pain was mind-numbing. I could barely breathe for what felt like an eternity. I didn't understand why she had let me live, had even asked for help, but coherent thoughts were rare as I tried to calm my shaking body enough to stand back up. And as I lifted my eyes from the dirty floor, I felt the air being knocked out of my lungs again. For the briefest of moments, I thought I was facing the shadow thing as a figure, shrouded in darkness and accompanied by whirling wires, walked down the hallway and I clutched my knife with little hope of making it out alive again. I can't describe the relief I felt when it turned out to be a trick of the light. It wasn't the shadow thing and its wires that came closer, but the detective, who walked past said wires and looked down at me. "You alright, kid?" he asked. He was even paler than last time. I was so far from alright it took a conscious effort not to cry. Yet I managed to ignore the searing pain and smile weakly at him as I lied, "Yeah, I'm fine." He reached his hand out and I let him pull me back on my feet. Again, there was the faint sensation of electricity at the touch. I blamed the buzzing air around us. "We need your help," I then explained. "The man with the briefcase is injured. Could be literally life or death." He told me to lead the way and I hurried back in the direction from where I had come. The door that had been overgrown with wires was free again. I thought the wires might have disappeared with the bandaged girl. Anyways, we went back to the wagon where Amy and the man with the briefcase were waiting, without any incident interrupting our short journey. The man with the briefcase still lay unconscious on the floor, but now Amy lay next to him, arms awkwardly around him, cuddled against his not burned side. "The hell are you doing?" I asked harshly because I was very tired by now and seeing my only friend in this hellhole cuddle with some inhuman monster was where I drew the line. He was really cold. I was worried. She didn't move from her position. "He's not human. Maybe he's supposed to be cold? I wouldn't fucking know." I reached down and yanked her to her feet. She immediately lost balance and collapsed against me. For a few moments, we just stood still and stared at each other until she slowly reached her hand out and touched my cheek. "What happened?" she whispered. I shook my head. "I'll tell you later." She bit down on her lip, her eyes full of pity. For a second I thought she would ask again, but she turned her head, not letting go of me, and looked at the detective. "I tried to open his briefcase," she explained. "It didn't work." "Only opens with blood," the detective replied curtly. "One of you needs to do it." "I don't bleed." Of course he didn't bleed. I hated this cursed place more with every second. "Eve, I need a knife." Amy pulled the blade from my grasp before I had the time to process everything. My thoughts were still focused on how the detective simply didn't bleed, when she had already sliced her palm open and let a few drops of blood fall onto the briefcase. "Close your eyes," the detective ordered us. "Wouldn't want you two to lose your sanity." I didn't even question it anymore, just squeezed my eyes shut and wrapped my arms a little tighter around the frail woman who still pressed her body against me. I didn't know what happened when the detective actually opened the briefcase, but I certainly felt something. A faint sensation of freezing heat brushed against my skin. There was a strange sound like a muted storm and for just the fraction of a second, I found myself unable to breathe. But as quickly as it had started, it was already over again and as I opened my eyes, the man with the briefcase was standing and his wounds had healed without leaving a trace on his body. Amy looked incredibly relieved. "How are you, sir?" "I'm quite all right," he answered. "You might have saved my life today." "Thank you a lot, Evelyn." "Nikki." I could do nothing but watch as Amy let go of me, stumbled over to him and wrapped her arms around him. He didn't reciprocate the hug, but he didn't complain either while she held onto him and cried with relief. Maybe it should have struck me as odd that he actually called her Nikki now. I should have paid more attention to the fact that it wasn't possible that an inhuman like him would consider a mere human a friend. But I was tired and absolutely done with everything and therefore, I did nothing but look at the detective and roll my eyes. But he didn't even notice me. The whole situation was so bizarre that I couldn't help but chuckle. We called it a day after that. It was almost midnight by then, the adrenaline had left my body and I was on the verge of collapsing and honestly, enough had happened for one day. I somehow managed to convince both the detective and the man with the briefcase to meet with us tomorrow morning to discuss how we could save the midnight train and then I took Amy and we headed back to my compartment to get some rest. That's it for today, guys. No evil cliffhangers this time, but almost a happy ending. I hope you appreciate that. I can't promise that will happen again. We're exactly halfway through. To say it bluntly, shit is getting real now. Anyways, tomorrow we'll get a little closer to the truth about the midnight train's problem. Until then, don't walk alone in cursed places. You'll only end up with scars.